I had one brother, James Edward McCuistion, who's about 5 years younger than me. Well, my mother at first was just a homemaker for a while, and she worked at several different kinds of jobs, one of which was to teach elementary school in Farmington for about 3 years. And the funny thing is, her students I would teach in high school when I was hired. So we got to compare notes. She also worked for the University of Arkansas Athletic Department for years. So my dad worked mostly at the VA hospital. He was a purchasing agent and then a contract clerk. I would help my mother. I was always good at drawing and creating things. So back in the early 60s, there wasn't much audio-visual equipment for our first grade teachers, so I drew lots of little characters like the gingerbread man or whatever so that she could use it on a flannel board. And some of my high school students remembered those characters. First jobs that I remember getting any money for was babysitting, and then mowing some yards. And then when I was in high school, I worked for North College Nursery and Kindergarten in Fayetteville. And the funny thing is, I was like a junior in high school, but some of the babies or the young kids there, I would end up teaching in high school later. My earliest memories of Farmington are wonderful. For the first 5 years of my life, we lived in a small apartment at the side of a great big rambling farmhouse, which is now where Come and Go is, at the corner of Broyles Street and Highway 62. Of course, there wasn't a Broyles Street yet. Our pond was where Broyles Street was. And behind the big old farmhouse was a great big red barn that had a dairy business kind of at the side of it, where they milked a few cows. My grandparents lived in the farmhouse, and we rented the little apartment. So for my first 5 years, I was much spoiled, only granddaughter in the family. My grandparents were Ernie or Ernest McCuistion, and my granny was Edith McCuistion, and where they lived was almost kind of in the center of the community at that time period. Lots of people would gather at their house, so there was always something going on at the house. Well, I can remember sitting on the front porch and getting excited when we saw a car on the highway, because everybody would lean forward and try to see who it was that was getting ready to drive by. And occasionally there would be somebody we didn't recognize. And the big fun days were when the University of Arkansas played Tulsa, the University of Tulsa, because I would ride my tricycle out to the edge of the highway and would get to count the cars, see how high I could go, and sometimes we'd get up to like 80 cars that would go by in an hour and a half on their way back to Tulsa, and it was so exciting. I also remember my grandfather. We would go on lots of Sunday drives, but one night he got us all up one weeknight, and we went up to Dixon Street in Fayetteville and saw a new contraption called a television. And there was a crowd of people. It was close to the Shipley Baking Company, about halfway up Dixon Street, and some appliance store had a TV in the window. And my grandpa Ernie said, "I'm gonna buy one of those." So he did, and we were one of the first families in Farmington to have a TV. And luckily, my grandpa had a great big old kind of round, almost kind of octagonal on one end shaped living room. And I can remember it was just standing room only to look at a little screen that was about this big. And my dad, his job was to climb up on the roof and twist the antenna around, trying to get Channel 2, which was NBC, and Channel 6, which was CBS. Living in Farmington and being kind of the center location, it was exciting because we got to see lots of folks. And they were always interested in the television, but sometimes everybody would come running in their nightgowns or robes or whatever, because my grandpa had one of the few big storm cellars. And anytime they became frightened about a tornado, here'd come all the neighbors, and we'd all go down to the storm cellar, and my dad would be called on to lock the door, and we'd all huddle inside. So I remember, I thought it was exciting, you know, when you're 3 or 4 or 5 years old. It's just, that's fun to get up in the middle of the night and see everybody in their bathrobes. But I just remember having lots of good times, being the only little girl in the family and a bunch of boy cousins that I could kind of boss around. We also had, they would play croquet tournaments, and I think they get pretty heated. These were usually on Sunday afternoons, and they played in the big front yard, which would be about where the gas pumps are in front of Come and Go. Used to, you know, we'd all just line up and laugh and giggle, and some of the neighbor men would get really mad. Mostly it was the men doing it. The women didn't want to get involved that much, but occasionally they'd get drug into it. And usually when it was all over in the summers, we'd go to a great big old long rock that was set on some concrete blocks on either end. It was a great big outdoor bench seat, and they'd split 2 or 3 watermelons that had been cooling off in big tubs of ice, and everybody'd have watermelon, and we'd all gather around that big rock, which, by the way, I think is going to be put in the new area for the Briar Rose. The lady that owns the Briar Rose said that the rock is still in, well, they drug it down to her front yard, so I'm glad to see that my papa's rock is going to be where people can sit at it again. But we had lots of fun. Well, there weren't very many. Where the tobacco shop is, I think there was, I'm trying to remember, I believe it was called Giles Store, maybe. And then there was also DeLance Phillips's rock store. And then years on down the line, the Davis grocery store was built into a little farmhouse. But not too many stores, just mostly houses. The funny thing about my family is that everyone went to Farmington High School. My parents graduated in the class of 43. Their older brothers and sisters and younger brothers and sisters all went to Farmington. And even my little brother, when my mother started teaching first grade in the early 60s, she moved my little brother from Bates Elementary to Farmington, and he ended up graduating from Farmington, but I didn't. We had moved up the road from my grandparents' house, bought a little house right on the edge of the Farmington-Fayetteville city limits, and it was the Fayetteville school bus that came by my house. We were right on the edge. I could have gone either way, but because the school bus came by, I went to Bates Elementary and ended up graduating from Fayetteville High School. But I think I made up for it because I taught at Farmington for 40 years. Well, I continued to live in Farmington and around Farmington most of my life. I did have an apartment in Fayetteville for a little while, but Farmington has always been my home, my hometown. And when I graduated from the University of Arkansas back in 1972, I had a double major in art, primarily art, but also I had taken a lot of history and ended up with more hours in history and social studies. And at the time, the economy was pretty much tanking at the the end of the Civil War, no, at the end of the Vietnam War. So I was looking for a job, and I had taken the teaching block. I had gone through arts and sciences, but I went over to the College of Education and took the practice teaching block. So I was qualified to teach, and I thought, well, I need to do something to earn some money to get out of my parents' house. So I kind of had an in with some of the folks in Farmington. My mom and dad had been involved in the PTA for many, many years, and had an uncle on the school board, which didn't hurt. So, so I was hired to teach art. But when I came to the school to sign my contract and everything, Mr. George Ledbetter, who that was his last year, was my first year to teach. And he said, well, now we're going to be having you teach social studies. And I said, oh, I thought I was going to teach art. He said, well, we might give you one art class. So I had several different preps. I think I had about 5 different preps. And, yeah, you know, the first 2 or 3 years were really difficult because I was still living at home, trying to raise a down payment to buy my own car. I'd been using my mother's car some, but so the first year I taught, I was driving my mother's car to work with my little brother in the seat beside me, who was a senior that year. And I pretty much ruined his senior year because I taught him in a history class. And when he didn't behave, I'd go home and tell Mom. So his senior year was kind of ruined, but then I also taught 5 first cousins. And then I don't know how many second cousins or kissing cousins or whatever. I virtually knew everybody in Farmington, which was both good but also bad, because they felt perfectly fine to criticize me about anything I ever did wrong, or even call up my parents and tattle because I had given their son a C when he deserved an A. So it was an interesting situation. I got the job, but it was also pretty tough there for the first 3 or 4 years to get the respect that I needed to be able to teach well. Mr. Ledbetter every so often would come by that first year and fling the door open, and he'd say, we did your daddy a favor hiring you. You better do a good job, and then slam the door. And there I'd be, you know, looking at all my kids who would just be sitting there laughing, thinking it was funny. So it was kind of a different way to start a teaching career. But I got hooked. I loved it. You know, after the first 2 or 3 years, I thought, this is what I've got to do. And I kept thinking, well, I'll move someplace else. But I got so attached to the families around here, and I just loved Farmington. I didn't want to move after a while. So I don't really remember the young man who was my first principal. That first year was just kind of a blur of just like, I don't know what I'm doing. His name was Hayes, and the kids called him Hannibal Hayes, and he was very nice, but I didn't seem to have a whole lot of to do with him. I think he was kind of trying to hang on and learn the job too. Second principal was a little short guy named Royal Osborne, who was always hitching his pants up and standing on his tippy toes. He wore kind of elevator shoes. He was shorter than I was considerably. And we had some tough boys at that time period, so he was always, you know, trying to act like he was tough. He was a nice man, but he was kind of out of his element. And then let's see, the third principal was Randy Lynch, who, when I first taught, the first year I taught, he was a science teacher. But then they elevated him up to being the principal, and I worked under him for years. Oh, and then there were just others on down the line. Let's see, Vol Eads, he's worked different places, but He was one of my favorites. He still sometimes subs at the high school, just kind of keep in touch with people. He was a good principal. Alan Holland, for a couple of years, was our principal, along with being football coach. And then a funny thing happened. I finally had a principal who I had taught, and this was Blaine Hypes. When I did my student teaching in Springdale High School, he was a student there. So Blaine was my first ex-student principal. And then since then, let's see, Clayton Williams, who's an assistant principal at the high school, I taught him, and there's been a lot of them. Randy Thrash was another very good principal that I worked under. Oh my goodness. I've taught thousands of students, literally thousands. And I find there's something kind of funny. I tend to remember those first 2 or 3 years or the last couple. The ones in the middle tend to kind of run together. I remember students in odd ways. I remember primarily where they sat in relationship to my desk, which is weird. When I go to Walmart early in the morning to try to avoid this, it gets kind of embarrassing when somebody comes up and grabs my grocery cart and says, "I was your favorite student. Now you tell me who I am. Who am I? Remember me? Who am I? I was your favorite student." And I'll think, God, I don't know, because usually it's a guy doing this, and usually they're bald, and they got a big beer gut, and usually a big beard. And I'll think, I don't think you look like that in high school. You know? And they don't realize that, you know, as a teacher, we are just standing there looking at, well, you know, 6 classes a day times at least 30. They're looking at me, and sometimes they've had me in for 2 or 3 years in a row. But it's kind of hard to remember, but I do remember certain students very, very clearly, usually because of some escapade they pulled, or I don't know, or a sweet note they left me, or, oh goodness, there's just lots and lots of really, really good students. I think probably one of the very best students I ever had who wrote beautifully. Now, as the years went by, I taught AP History, which required essay writing. And Gary Hamlin, Jackie Hamlin's son, wrote essays better than anyone I've ever taught before or since. I used to be real jealous of his writing ability. He stands out. Of course, my little brother, he was he was one of my students, and I ruined his senior year. I also had all of these cousins. Golly, I hate to even start trying to mention them, but no, there was some real little toots. I don't know, the Edwards boys, all of them were Doug, who was the oldest, and Mike, and let's see, the twins, Tommy and Donnie, and then their little brother. Oh Lord, I knew I was going to do this. Little redhead. Cannot remember his name, but they were all very individual and very funny, or real cut-ups or whatever. Warren, that's who he was. Warren was always just bugging the living daylights out of me, and Tommy and Donnie, I learned the differences between them. A lot of people didn't realize, you know, I could tell which was which. They were pretty much identical twins, but I remember that family very, very well. The Pierce family, Joey and John and Cassie and all of their, Laura that we called Bootsy. I tend to remember families of kids. And then as the years went by, they would start coming in going, well, you taught my dad. And I'll go, yeah, so you better sit down and be quiet. And sometimes I would make deals with them. I'd say, I won't tell if you won't tell. And they would grin and giggle about it and all. But it also was very helpful with parent-teacher conferences because sometimes, when mom or dad would show up, I could just say, well, remember how you were in high school? Well, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Junior's got some of the same problems. So that would give me an in to really kind of, discuss what we needed to do in a more effective way. But my friends were mostly my boy cousins who were a little bit older. Farmington was not very populated, and we didn't live close to other kids that much when I was really small. But one of the things that I loved to do was to make mud pies on top of our old storm cellar where there was where the dirt had kind of exposed the reinforced concrete. And I'd sit up there and make my mud pies and decorate them with dandelions and all sorts of other flowers. Or we would, my boy cousins, who were all older and viewed me as nuisance, I realized this later, they would have me stand behind the big rock seat, and I would play banker. I would go get leaves off of the lilac bushes in the front yard of my papa's house. And sometimes I'd have to wait a good 5 or 10 minutes before they'd come around on their tricycles or bicycles. And I'd think, where'd they go? I realized later they were just keeping me out of their hair for a while they went down to the barn or the dairy barn or whatever and did whatever boys were doing at that time. But there was one little girl that lived across the street from us, Tricia Rouse, but I was about 4 or 5 or so, 5 or 6, I can't really remember, they moved out into the country, so I didn't get to see her that often. We moved up the highway towards Fayetteville, so most of my friends went to Fayetteville as I was growing up. What did my parents do for fun? Well, my aunts and uncles were heavily involved in square dancing, and but my mother had a bad knee, so my mom and dad didn't do that much. But they played croquet, and in the winter, when it was too cold to go out and play croquet, they played caroms on a board. Where you knock these, with your thumb, you knock these little things, you try to knock them into the little round rings, you try to knock them into the nets on each side of the board. Or they played card games. As the years went by and the bowling alleys were cleaned up a little bit and made more suitable, my mom and dad both bowled in different leagues, and I can remember spending a lot of time in the bowling alleys watching my parents bowl and ball games. My whole family was nuts about ball games. I can remember going to the really old gym over here when it was a new gym. It had just been built 2 or 3 years prior to it, to when I started going to it. And we would go watch my younger aunts and uncles play ball, and then cousins. Now, I did not go to Farmington, but I did attend lots of ball games in Farmington. Basketball games, football when it started way back, I guess, in the early 60s. I think it was 8-man football, and they didn't even have bleachers. We would just go stand along the sidelines and try to figure out what was going on. But fishing, oh my gosh. Even my mother kind of liked to fish, but all of my dad's side of the family were really outstanding fishermen. And the great excitement was when they were building Beaver Lake, and they finally opened it. And we went camping a lot, and also over to Bull Shoals. So you have heard about the Farmington Parade, the first annual Farmington Parade. is usually the story that most people who know me want me to tell. It occurred in the fall of 1983. I had already been teaching. I was going into my 11th year, and I really thought I knew everything. I thought, hey, I've taught 10 years. I've got this whipped. There's nothing that can surprise me anymore. Well, something surprised me. At that point in my teaching career, I was frequently either junior or senior sponsor, and my co-sponsor was a lady named Regina Gable, and she's still one of my very best friends. And she and I were co-sponsors a lot. And one thing that we learned and commented on over the years was how certain classes had certain personalities. Some of them could be real, you know what, raisers, and others could be just very docile and easygoing and laid back and fun-loving. This particular class, that was going to be the class of 1984, were dominated by some of the most headstrong girls that I ever taught. And most of the officers were girls, and it had been kind of a struggle trying to restrain them over the last year or so, but they were seniors that year, and one day they came bustling in to Mrs. Gable's room and said, Mrs. Gable, we got a great idea. You're gonna love this. And she said, oh, what is it? And they said, we want to have a homecoming parade. And she said, And she said, let's go talk to Miss McCuistion. I was right across the hall, so here they all came. Just a whole stampede of women, determined women. And the ringleader of the pack was a young girl named Teresa Essery, and she was our president. And she said, now Mrs. Gable said she thought this was a good idea, and Mrs. Gable was going, no. But she said, we want to have a homecoming parade. So before I could say anything, I was just horrified. I thought, parade? Where are we going to parade kids? We're on a state highway right here. We can't have a parade. So she, Gable turned right around and she said, well, now children, that sounds like it would be a good idea, but our school is right here on this State Highway 62. She has a real soft voice, and she said, I don't think that the police would allow us to close down a highway to have a parade. So that's probably going to be why we can't do this. So the kids took off, and we looked at each other and thought, okay, good, we scotched that. We don't want that. Well, a couple of hours later, here they all came, running back in, going, the police think it's a great idea. They're all for it. In fact, they're talking to Mr. Massey right now about it. And the two of us just looked at each other like, oh my gosh, now we're committed. We couldn't believe it. The police thought it was a great idea to shut down a state highway. Now, at that time, Highway 62 was just a little two-lane highway, but it was pretty busy. Traffic was whizzing by all the time. But, we were committed. So as time went along, we had about 2 or 3 weeks to try to figure out how we were going to do this. And word got out, and we started fielding phone calls from everybody in Farmington. And half of Northwest Arkansas heard about it and wanted to be in it. So while we were teaching, some kid from the office would come down and say, you got another phone call. So I'd go down and I'd say, yes, ma'am, yes, I understand. Yes, you live here in Farmington. Okay, you would like to ride your bicycle in the parade. Well, okay. So people called wanting to ride their bicycles in the parade. They wanted to ride their horses in the parade. We even had a group of women who, for the fun of it, had decided it would be good exercise to form a belly dancing troupe. They called and said, we'd like to be in the parade. And I said, oh, okay. And I knew that wasn't going to go over too well with our principal, or our superintendent, Mr. Massey. But one of them was my Aunt Darlene, and she was the wife of the president of the school board. So I thought, ooh, I don't know if I can tell my Aunt Darlene Elkins that she can't belly dance in this parade or not. But anyhow, everybody all over Farmington wanted to be in the parade, and it just grew and grew and grew. And one day, Mr. Massey, who was our superintendent, called Miss Gable and I down, and he said, "No, he was a lovely man. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely adored Mr. Massey. He was a good superintendent, but he was very nervous, and when he would get nervous, he would kind of twitch and sniff a little bit. So he was twitching and sniffing by the time we got in and sat down in front of him, and he said, well, I've heard a rumor that there might be some women dancers in the parade." And Regina and I, Mrs. Gable and I, looked at each other and kind of rolled our eyes and said, well, yes. And when we told him who it was, he really started shaking and snorting a little bit more. And he said, well, is there any way we can stop it? And I said, well, you're going to have to do that. I said, I don't have the authority to do that. And he said, do you think they're going to be wearing J-strings? And Miss Gable and I kind of looked at each other like, J-strings? And she said, he means J-string. And I said, oh. And I said, no, I don't think they're going to be wearing J-strings. He said, can you guarantee that? And I said, I'll try. So I don't, I can't even remember if they were in the parade or not. But everybody was. But so, time lurched along, and then the next day, Mr. Flurkey, Kent Flurkey, he was one of our principals, and he was always nervous too, but he exhibited it by pulling up his pants constantly and wiping sweat. So we got called down to the principal's office, and we were standing there, and Mr. Flurkey came in, and he was hitching up his pants like as best he could, and was wiping sweat off. And he said, now, about this parade business. We said, yes. And he said, what are we going to do? What are we going to do, ladies? What will we do if it rains? Will we have it in the gym? And Regina Gable was so quick-witted, and she's kind of a smart ass. And just like that, she said, yes, Mr. Flurkey, we will have the parade in the gym. But my suggestion is to bring the horses in at the last. And he never even caught on. He was so worried. He was so worried about the disaster that was looming up on the horizon that he didn't catch her sarcasm. And she and I just walked out and stood in the hall and kind of held hands and said, what are we doing? Are we going to survive this or not? So the day of the parade, thank God it was not raining, but it was hot. It got way up into the 90s that day. It was in early October. And we were playing Lincoln High School, the Lincoln Wolves. So everybody had been in this frantic mode of creating floats for the first time. I mean, we were going to have some serious floats. And there were so many people that wanted to be in the parade, we had to line them up. The police told us that we were going to have to line them up on Holland Drive and then come all the way down through Farmington, all the way to the school. And at that point, we were going to have to divert the kids around the Round Elementary School building because Boom Boom would not let us have the parade unless we promised to throw candy at his elementary students. Now, for those people who were associated with the school during those years, you know who I'm talking about. Boom Boom was Jesse Howard Sr. He was the principal of the elementary, and he was quite a character. He was from Louisiana, and he wore this great big old 10-gallon hat, and he carried a pistol under the seat of his old, I think it was a Cadillac that he drove around in. And he was loud. That's why we called him Boom Boom. He was a very good principal, but he was quite the character. And he said, by God, you know, if I let my kids out, you better throw candy at them. So we had promised Boom Boom, all right at the tail end of the parade, we'll divert it around the round building before we go into the gym parking lot with all the floats and everything. So the day of the parade, Miss Gable and I, who are designated to be the grand marshals of the parade, and we were given these great big old homecoming mums with a great big red F pipe cleaner right in the middle of it. Well, here came the police car to pick us up because we were going to lead the parade. And we had to sit in the front seat. And now this was still back in the early 80s where we were expected to dress up in heels and skirts and everything. So we both had on some kind of short skirts and high heels and with our great big mums and our little blazer jackets and everything. And the policeman that came up was one of my former students, Officer Dennis Reed. I used to think of him as Dennis the Menace. I thought it would be you, Dennis. So he said, all right, ladies, get in. And because Regina's taller than I am, she said, you're going to have to sit in the middle. And I said, oh. So I kind of hiked my skirt up and I try to wedge my leg around. And it's a console-like thing. And after I got sitting up on it, and it was hard to hang on to, you know, there wasn't much of anything I could hang on to. Dennis said, that's where we store our extra guns. I said, oh, well, good, I'm glad to know that. So Regina crawled in beside me, Dennis crawled in, and here we went. We were gonna go all the way up to where Holland Drive meets Highway 62, and we were gonna lead the parade. The funny thing was, as we were driving along, I noticed how desolate and empty Farmington seemed to be. The only people that were sitting in lawn chairs were my mom and dad and an uncle and a couple of cousins and 2 or 3 neighbors. And I thought, where is everybody? And that's when it dawned on me everybody was in the parade. There wasn't hardly anybody to watch the parade. But lo and behold, somebody had taken it upon themselves to call one of our country radio stations. So they were set up in front of what was called, oh my goodness, I can't even remember. It was a little old, it was before it was Come and Go, whatever that little grocery store was. They had set up a little booth there and they were broadcasting live and describing all of the wonderful events that were about to happen in Farmington. So we get up to the front of the parade, everybody gets lined up. It's a logistical nightmare. Traffic has already been stopped for probably about a half an hour at that point. And we're talking about chicken trucks, feed trucks. Everybody that traveled Highway 62 that day was already sitting at the side of the road, not happy. So here starts the parade, and we slowly go down through Farmington. The band, led by their sponsor, was Rhett Miles. He was a great big old tall guy with freckles. They knew about 3 or 4 songs, and they had already repeated them about 7 or 8 times. And they were starting to wheeze because, we were marching about 2 miles or so, and it was hot. Well, we got almost all the way down through Farmington, and over Dennis's record, or radio, we hear, there's been a child that's been run over by a float. And we all 3 just look at each other just in a horrible panic. And I'm thinking, I knew this was going to happen. So he jumps out and takes off running. Now we got the whole parade backed up behind us. And as luck would have it, one of the very last floats, it was kind of an upper elementary float, a bunch of little kids, was where this supposedly happened. And it was up there, kind of on that S curve. So it was quite a distance away from where we were. So Dennis takes off running. He just leaves the patrol car. Regina Gable jumps out and takes off running, and I'm stuck trying to get out of it. I was stuck in, somehow or other, in the steering wheel and trying to get out of the car, and I almost fell completely out. I lost one of my shoes. I had to go back in and get one of my high heels, put them on, and so all 3 of us, to varying degrees, are running back to see what happened with this child. So we're just going through Farmington, and my mom and dad, who were sitting in lawn chairs, Mom yelled, "What happened? What happened?" And I just said, so I'm running, I'm bringing up the rear. Well, come to find out, it wasn't much of anything at all. These kids were sitting on a big old flatbed trailer, and they were almost dragging their feet. And this kid jumped off and ripped his pants, apparently, or maybe fell off. He wasn't hurt. His pants were just ripped, and that's why he was all upset. So first thing I know, way in the distance, I see Dennis running as fast as he can, and behind him, Mrs. Gable, like this. She's wearing high heels too. And Dennis streaks past me and gets to the patrol car, and he starts moving on down the road. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, Dennis, wait a minute, we got to direct this. And I look back, and Regina's yelling at me, "Stop him." So I take off running because we had promised Boom Boom, Mr. Howard, that the parade would go around the round building. And Regina and I did not want to have to put up with him griping at us from then on until the end of time about how we did not throw candy at his elementary kids. We had great big bags of candy. The football boys had it, the cheerleaders had it. Everybody was going to throw candy at Boom Boom and his elementary kids. Well, Dennis didn't know that. So we were afraid that Dennis was just going to go right past the elementary. So because I was ahead of Regina, I start running as fast as I can. And no matter how fast I go, I can't seem to get past that football boys float. And they're thinking it's hilarious. And they're throwing hard candy at me, and they're making rude gestures, and they're going ba-boom, 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 and stuff. And I'm getting mad. I'm furious. And then I spot the girl on the three-wheeler that was dressed as a clown that had a whole bunch of balloons behind her. Shelley Jones, one of our erstwhile senior class officers. And Shelley had been going back and forth, riding like a crazed demon, with the balloons flapping. And I whistle real loud. I go as loud as I can. I said, "Shelley, get over here." And so she comes screeching up beside me, and I said, "I got to get in front of the parade right now. You got to get me up there." So she said, "Hop on back." Well, to do that, I almost had to pull my skirt completely up, but I got on back there, and my feet are tucked down, and I'm getting hit with balloons. Nobody could see who I was. I figured, well, maybe my dignity is intact because there's balloons bouncing all over me, but they could kind of see my feet sticking out. So I said, "Get in front of Dennis's patrol car. Get me up there as fast as I can." So we're streaking on up. Meantime, Mrs. Gable manages to get she's run hard enough to where she's right opposite the football boys. And so they start pelting her with candy. They're throwing the candy at the wrong people. They're wasting it on the sponsors, and that made us mad. But we finally get up there, and I just barely managed to turn Dennis around the round building. And Boom Boom's standing out there going, "Throw me some candy, throw me some candy, throw me some candy." So everybody was throwing candy. The elementary was pleased. Everybody was happy. The few kids that were not in the parade that had misbehaved and were in in-house suspension were being guarded by Miss Pam Redfern along the side of the road right in front of the school. And as Shelley and I came streaking by, I could hear her voice going, "Who is that sitting behind Shelley? It looks like Miss McCuistion's feet." So they started hooting and hollering. They're thinking that's great. I thought, I don't care. I have no dignity left. Well, finally, Shelley, the clown, and I managed to wheel into the parking lot by the gym and the Agri building, and Mrs. Gable came huffing and puffing up. She was just strangling. She was exhausted, and I kind of looked at her and I said, "What happened to your corsage?" And we looked down. Mine didn't look a whole lot better, but we looked down and she had strewn white petals carnation petals all the way down through Farmington. And all that was just kind of twisting around was a big red F. And at that point, our football coach, Alan Holland, and Randy Lynch, one of our principals, was just hooting and hollering and laughing and getting hysterical. And Miss Gable whipped around and yelled at him. Very few people ever yelled at Coach Holland, but I think she yelled at him and said, "You better get out here and help me. Your job is to park these floats." And they just kind of snorted and said, "Well, these kids don't know how to back up or anything. They're just going to come in however they're going to come in." And so there was an argument ensuing, and at that point, I thought, I just need to get off of this three-wheeler. And I couldn't figure out a way to do it with any kind of dignity at all. So finally, I just kind of slid off the back, and I ended up laying in the dirt and in the gravel, rolling around, and it was hot. And I finally got up and staggered around, and at that point, more and more floats started coming in, and Miss Gable and I were just like, "Oh, hurry, finish this day." But one of the last floats to arrive was our second place winner, driven by another one of my friends, and I promised not to tell her name, but she was our home ec teacher. And she was an old farm girl. She knew how to drive or haul or pull farm equipment. She was real proud of her expertise. And the FHA float was an award winner. It had the goalposts and this kind of stuffed dummy of, I'm sorry, Lincoln folks, but it was a dummy of the Lincoln wolf kind of dangling. And there were the FHA girls on the back. And she was so proud of herself because she had managed to maneuver all of the obstacles and get all the way down through Farmington. I mean, she had steered a clear course until she got into the parking lot, and there was such mass confusion, and she didn't quite know which way to go. So she thought, well, she'd circle around this great big old tree that we had in the middle of the parking lot. And as she did so, a branch clipped the goalpost and the Lincoln wolf, which flopped up all over the place. The wolf was decapitated, the head went one way, the body fell off. She was dragging it, losing parts of the float, and I think a couple of the girls that jumped off. And finally managed to come to a grinding halt, and she was furious too. And the two men who were supposed to be directing traffic were not doing their job. And Mrs. Gable, now I did not see this because I was behind the float, but Mrs. Gable maintained that they were both just almost rolling in the gravel. They were so tickled. This was Coach Holland and Mr. Lynch. So finally the day ended, the parade ended, but the day it didn't end because it dawned on us that the radio station had decided to set up on the football field and record our pep rally, which at that point we were just about ready to cancel. We all just wanted to go sit someplace. But no, I had to get up, dust off, and go staggering around and try to shoo all these kids off the floats and get them over to the football field. And by that time it was like, oh, I don't know, 92, 93 degrees. It was going on 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Hottest football pep rally we ever had. The band came staggering in. I mean, they were just dragging their butts and their instruments, and they piled up into the bleachers, and they just were puffing and wheezing, and the little cheerleaders got out. They were bedraggled, and they were trying to do "Go Red," "Yay, go White," "Yay," and people were hoarse and laying on the bleachers, and nobody was cheering, and it just dragged on and on and on and on and on. And finally, the great parade was over. But we had to deal with the aftermath, which were lots of complaints. You know, there were a lot of people disturbed in Farmington from their sleep because the dogs didn't settle down for, at least a week. They would bark at any tiny sound they heard. They'd all just start this cacophony of howling, you know, and everybody blamed it on the parade. And several of our residents called and said that their dogs would not shut up because of the parade. And, you know, what do you say? And then, but the worst complaints came from all of these truckers who had sat for well over 2 hours, maybe even, longer, on the highway with their chickens or their feed or whatever they were hauling. And rumor had it that the trucks and the traffic were backed up all the way almost to Prairie Grove. It was a massive traffic jam. And when they finally cut loose and started letting them through, these people were saluting us in a very undignified way as they went by. And it was just like, oh, what else can go wrong? Well, we did win the game that night, and in fact, that season, they went undefeated. So I guess maybe it didn't disrupt our football team too much. They mostly were just throwing candy at everybody, just braining people with that candy that we'd bought. Boom Boom got his share of the candy. The parade was over, and wiser heads then prevailed and said that would be the last annual homecoming parade in the history of Farmington. And I don't think we've had another one. Now, we've had some Christmas parades, but as far as I know, we haven't had another parade that shut down a state highway for over 2 hours. So I tell that story to people because I have a unique perspective on it all. So anyway, that's the story of the Great Homecoming Parade of the fall of 1983. Well, being a product of this community and having lived in or around Farmington and worked in Farmington almost my entire life, and my families on both sides go back generations. I've grown up just hearing all these stories about Farmington, the past, the present, and what people's goals are for the future. I've been, of course, real involved in the school and real proud of this community. One of the things that I know this community has always done is turned out and voted for whatever millage issue we needed. And the school, despite being such a tiny school when I first started teaching, we were a 1B school. And now, we're 5A. The community, the school has grown immensely since then, but the attitude has always been, we support the school, we support the town. People turn out and do what they need to do whenever the need arises. And Farmington people always have had a very progressive, good attitude. It's been my experience. And I think the thing that is the greatest factor about Farmington are the people, the people who live here. And now we've got lots of newcomers coming in, and I think they're beginning to appreciate that this is a very nice community and a beautiful place. It's still safe, it's still friendly. It's getting to be bigger and more prosperous than it used to be, but everyone still seems to be very supportive, and I am immensely proud of the fact that I was able to get through 40 years of teaching. I got off to a rough start, but I thoroughly enjoyed getting to teach those 40 years at Farmington High School. But I did tell my friends, this was the cutting off point. I said, I'll be darned if I'm going to still be teaching when some kid comes up and says, you taught my grandpa. And they were in the 8th and 9th grade when I quit in 2012. So I thought, no, I can't deal with that. That's just too much. But anyway, I appreciate getting to tell some of my stories, and as you all know, I'm pretty long-winded. I'm sorry. This is a very friendly community. It's in a beautiful place, and the people always are supportive of one another, and it's what makes Farmington special are the people who live here. Well, my favorite thing about Farmington are the people and the memories and all of the folks that I've gotten acquainted with and lived with for all of these years.